There's a moment in almost every relationship where attraction quietly changes without either person fully admitting it. Nothing dramatic happens. No betrayal. No screaming. No sudden ending. Just a slow emotional shift that feels almost invisible at first. The conversations still happen. The goodnight texts still arrive. The routines remain intact. But something underneath the connection starts collapsing silently. And most people don't recognize it until they begin feeling strangely anxious around the very person who once made them feel emotionally safe. Because reassurance has a strange effect on human behavior. The more certain people become that they won't lose you, the less intensely they often feel you. And that's the part people struggle admitting out loud. Attraction rarely disappears all at once. It fades through emotional certainty, through repetition, predictability, overexposure, through slowly removing every possible doubt until the relationship stops feeling emotionally alive and starts feeling emotionally guaranteed. You notice it in small moments first. They stop reacting when your name appears on their phone. Your attention becomes expected instead of exciting. The emotional energy that once felt electric starts feeling scheduled. Conversations slowly become updates. How was your day? What did you eat? What time are you sleeping? Nothing technically wrong. Nothing emotionally memorable either. And the terrifying part is how hard people work to avoid exactly this outcome, while accidentally creating it themselves. Because when someone fears losing emotional connection, they usually respond by increasing reassurance. More attention. More availability. More consistency. More emotional proof. You answer faster. You explain yourself more carefully. You become easier to reach. Easier to predict. Easier to emotionally secure. You start trying to remove uncertainty because uncertainty feels dangerous. But uncertainty was often part of the attraction in the beginning. Not toxic uncertainty. Psychological uncertainty. The kind that keeps someone emotionally alert. The kind that makes them wonder what you're thinking after the conversation ends. The kind that makes your attention feel emotionally valuable instead of permanently accessible. People rarely admit how much attraction depends on emotional tension. Not pain. Not games. Tension. The feeling that someone still has the ability to emotionally surprise you. And eventually that disappears. Not because love vanished. Because nothing feels emotionally at risk anymore. That's when people begin sensing emotional distance without understanding why. You can feel it sitting beside them. The pauses become longer. Their eyes drift toward their phone more often while you're talking. They still care. But they no longer observe you with the same intensity. Familiarity kills observation. At first they noticed everything. Your timing. Your reactions. Your silence. Your moods. Now your presence feels emotionally processed before you even speak. And people adapt frighteningly fast to emotional consistency. Especially when they stop fearing its disappearance. That realization quietly humiliates people. Because most individuals believe reassurance strengthens emotional attachment indefinitely. But reassurance repeated too often can slowly remove emotional impact. The compliments stop landing the same way. The affection feels expected. The emotional excitement weakens through repetition. Like hearing the same song too many times until it stops affecting you emotionally. And eventually people start confusing emotional stability with emotional numbness. That's where the atmosphere changes. You notice yourself trying harder to recreate reactions that once happened naturally. You send longer messages. You become more expressive. You try introducing more emotional warmth. But somehow the response feels smaller than before. Less enthusiasm. Less curiosity. less emotional urgency. And now you start overanalyzing tiny things. How long they take to reply. How differently they laugh with other people. How energized they suddenly seem around strangers. That part damages people quietly. Watching someone become emotionally livelier everywhere except with you. Especially when you remember how intensely they once reacted to your attention. You begin missing old versions of their behavior. Not even old versions of them. Just old reactions. The way they used to notice you. The way your presence once interrupted their focus. The way your attention once carried emotional weight. Now reassurance has made everything emotionally predictable. And predictable things stop creating tension. That's usually where emotional imbalance begins. Because once someone senses attention fading, they rarely become calmer. They become hyper-aware. You start rereading conversations. Checking whether your message sounded too emotional. Watching for subtle changes in enthusiasm. You notice when "I miss you" disappears from their language. You notice when they stop asking deeper questions. You notice when silence suddenly lasts longer than it used to. And the frightening part is how quickly emotional dependence forms during this stage. Because uncertainty creates obsession faster than reassurance ever could. Now basic affection starts feeling unusually important. A fast reply changes your mood. A small compliment feels emotionally relieving. One affectionate conversation temporarily removes days of overthinking. That's how emotional imbalance quietly develops. One person starts emotionally surviving on reactions that once happened naturally. And most people don't notice how much of themselves they lose trying to restore emotional intensity. You begin speaking differently. Carefully. Strategically. You stop saying certain things because you fear sounding emotionally needy. You hesitate before double texting. You pretend not to care while secretly waiting for attention. You slowly become less natural around someone who once felt emotionally effortless. That transformation damages identity more than people realize. Because attachment slowly reshapes behavior. Especially when emotional reassurance stops feeling guaranteed. And the humiliation becomes deeper when you notice yourself accepting emotional behavior you once would have rejected immediately. Delayed responses. Half-hearted attention. Conversations that feel emotionally empty. Inconsistency. Coldness disguised as tiredness. You tolerate it because you remember how things used to feel. People become addicted to emotional memory. That's what makes emotional withdrawal so psychologically powerful. Not because the current connection feels good, but because the contrast feels devastating. You keep chasing the emotional atmosphere that existed before reassurance made everything emotionally safe. And safe things rarely create obsession for very long. That's the contradiction nobody wants to admit. People say they want certainty. Complete reassurance. Complete emotional safety. Complete predictability. But emotionally, people often become most fixated on what feels slightly uncertain. That's why emotional withdrawal changes behavior so dramatically. The moment attention becomes inconsistent, people suddenly notice its value again. The silence becomes louder. The absence becomes emotionally visible. People notice disappearance faster than presence. And that realization ruins people internally once they experience it firsthand. Because they realize how much emotional value depended on tension they were unconsciously trying to eliminate. The frightening part is how subtle the shift feels while it's happening. There's no official moment where attraction dies. No announcement. Just tiny emotional reductions repeated quietly over time. Less enthusiasm. Less curiosity. Less emotional observation. Less psychological urgency. Until eventually you realize you're carrying most of the emotional atmosphere yourself. You're the one extending conversations, initiating affection, maintaining emotional energy, trying to recreate emotional depth. And nothing exposes emotional imbalance faster than feeling yourself work harder for reactions that once arrived effortlessly. That's when reassurance becomes psychologically dangerous. Because now you start increasing emotional effort precisely when emotional intensity is already weakening. You become more available, more accommodating, more emotionally responsive. You start fearing emotional distance so much that you accidentally remove the remaining tension entirely. And people rarely recognize this while it's happening. They think love should naturally mean complete emotional certainty, complete emotional transparency, constant reassurance. But emotional fascination doesn't always survive total predictability. Mystery disappears through overexposure. Not secrets. Overexposure. Too much emotional accessibility. Too much guaranteed attention. Too much emotional certainty without interruption. People slowly stop wondering about what already feels emotionally possessed. And that thought hurts because it feels cruelly unfair. Especially when reassurance came from love. Not manipulation. Not dishonesty. Love. Real emotional attachment. The desire to make someone feel emotionally secure. And yet emotional security repeated excessively can quietly flatten emotional intensity. That's the disturbing part. Good intentions still create emotional consequences. People don't always emotionally drift because something toxic happened. Sometimes they drift because nothing emotionally stimulating remains. No uncertainty. No anticipation. No psychological tension. Just emotional familiarity repeated endlessly until attention becomes automatic. And automatic things stop feeling emotionally rare. That realization becomes deeply painful once someone starts sensing they're no longer emotionally affecting the other person the same way. You notice they don't look at you as long anymore. Your absence no longer changes their behavior significantly. They stop reacting emotionally to your availability because they already expect it completely. You become emotionally integrated into their routine instead of emotionally felt. And routine rarely creates fascination. That's when people start panicking internally while pretending everything feels normal externally. You say, "It's okay," while replaying emotional distance in your head every night. You act relaxed while monitoring shifts in tone. You tell yourself you're overthinking while secretly feeling emotional collapse approaching. Because deep down, people can sense when they stopped emotionally surprising someone. And once that realization appears, reassurance starts feeling terrifying instead of comforting. You begin wondering whether you revealed too much of yourself. Whether emotional availability made you less exciting. Whether consistency weakened attraction. And those thoughts slowly distort self-worth. You start associating emotional value with unpredictability. Attention with scarcity. Desire with emotional distance. That's why some people become colder after emotional disappointment. Not because they stopped caring. Because they learned how differently people react once emotional access becomes uncertain again. And that realization changes people permanently. Sometimes silently. Sometimes cruelly. They stop expressing emotions as openly. They become harder to read. Harder to emotionally secure. Not always intentionally. Sometimes emotional pain naturally transforms people into someone more emotionally distant. Because they remember what happened the last time they made someone feel completely certain. The mystery disappeared. And eventually the emotional atmosphere changed completely. That's the hidden fear underneath reassurance. Not abandonment. Adaptation. The fear that someone will emotionally adapt to your presence so completely that your attention stops feeling psychologically meaningful. And people experience this fear everywhere now. In relationships, friendships, even online. You can feel it when someone who once instantly noticed your messages now leaves them sitting unopened for hours. You feel it when conversations lose emotional depth but continue mechanically. You feel it when someone becomes emotionally reactive toward strangers while emotionally passive toward you. That comparison quietly destroys people internally, especially when they remember how emotionally alive things once felt. Because the hardest part isn't always losing someone. Sometimes it's realizing they stopped feeling your emotional absence long before they physically left. And most people never fully recover from understanding how quietly attraction changes once reassurance removes mystery completely. Attention changes before love admits it. That's the part people carry with them afterward. The terrifying awareness that emotional intensity is fragile. That familiarity changes perception. That people slowly stop seeing what becomes emotionally constant. And eventually you start wondering whether anybody can remain emotionally fascinated forever once they fully know they can keep you. Maybe that's why emotional distance affects people so powerfully. Not because distance always creates love, but because uncertainty restores observation. It forces attention back into the connection. It interrupts emotional autopilot. And people suddenly notice what felt invisible moments earlier. Which means sometimes the thing people crave most emotionally is the very thing quietly destroying fascination through repetition. Constant reassurance. Constant availability. Constant emotional certainty. Until mystery disappears entirely. And once mystery disappears, people often don't realize what they lost until the emotional atmosphere already feels unfamiliar. Quiet. Heavy. Emotionally flat. Like two people slowly becoming witnesses to each other instead of emotional experiences. And that's usually where the loneliness becomes hardest to explain. Because technically, the relationship still exists. But emotionally, something stopped reacting a long time ago. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.